Welcome to our Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar. My name is Andrew Williams, and I'm the National Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for our foundation, and I'm the host for today's webinar. Our DEI webinars are designed to offer us as an organization important updates on the progress of our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Also, they are designed to help enhance our understanding of really critical issues related to inclusion, healing justice, and health equity in the treatment and recovery profession. Today's webinar is entitled Visions of Hope and Healing in Native Communities, and it was intentionally scheduled for today, which is Indigenous Peoples Day, a day that recognizes the sovereignty, the strength, resilience, cultures, and social justice visions of Indigenous communities. It is a day that also encourages us to reflect on the ways Indigenous people continue to experience discrimination and are disproportionately impacted by climate change, mining, drilling, and associated environmental degradation, as well as issues such as gender violence, homelessness, and health issues, including substance use disorder. 1 year after President Biden became the first US president to formally commemorate Indigenous Peoples Day, more than a dozen states now recognize some version of the holiday in lieu of Columbus Day. And more than 130 cities across our country, including Minneapolis, where I sit today, have adopted the holiday, choosing to listen to the calls from Indigenous groups and other activists not to celebrate Christopher Columbus. Today's DEI webinar is just one small way for us at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation to honor this day and to continue our journey of reckoning, repair, and collaboration with Native communities. Before I give our special guests a chance to introduce themselves, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. We start all of our DEI webinars with this acknowledgement, but this acknowledgement seems especially important and meaningful today. Let us recognize and acknowledge that our Hazelden Betty Ford treatment centers lie on the ancestral lands of multiple Native nations. And let us also recognize that its professional field and organization, we continue to benefit from the use and occupation of colonized Native lands. Let us make these acknowledgements today of the grounds on which we work, so that all those with whom we work know that we recognize our responsibilities to the Indigenous inhabitants of these lands, and that we strive to address our settler colonial history so that it guides our healing work in the present and in the future. Now, moving forward, I'm really delighted to give our special guests a chance to introduce themselves. I think among the highlights of my first year here with the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation has been the opportunity I've had in helping produce the latest episodes of the Recovery Equity Series, where I've had a chance to interview the 5 Native leaders who we'll have a chance to be in conversation with today. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Celina to begin our introductions.
Good morning. Aloha kaka'yaka from the land of Phoenix, Arizona. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Peepash and Akamo people here, whose land that I reside on. It's a beautiful morning. My mother's family comes from the island of Maui, and she's Hawaiian Portuguese. And then my biological father is Mexican American and also Native by way of Tamaulipas, Mexico, and through the Isleta Pueblo de Sioux in Texas. So very grateful to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Celina. Heidi?
Good morning. My name is Heidi Christensen. I work at Cook Inlet Tribal Council as the Cultural Peers Supervisor. I would also like to give a land acknowledgement to the land that I live and work on, are the Dena'ina people. Yes, and good morning. So good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. I believe soon we're going to be joined by Heidi's colleague, Daisy VanSlyke, who should be joining us shortly, and we'll hope to have her in the mix very soon. But for now, let me turn things over to our Hazelden Betty Ford colleagues, Sarita and Cecelia.
Hi, Ihani Wash Day. Good morning. My name is Sarita McGowan, Dr. McGowan, and I am of the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. My native name is Krainimi Bakojiki Tunapiki. So it's Little Eagle Woman, the Iowa people, and the Black Bear people is my clan. I have worked for Hazelden Betty Ford in Rancho Mirage, California, where I have been here about 4 years. And what really resonates with me is just this new approach that Hazelden is doing. I'm just really excited to be here. The land acknowledgement I'd like to acknowledge is the 9 Kuya tribes that we are on their land here in Rancho Mirage and the surrounding area. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarita.
Buju Anin, Indigo Magiziakwe, Cecelia Indindikas, Makwa Indorum, Indogi Manidulan. My name is Cecelia Jayme. I'm Director of Clinical Services in Center City, Minnesota, and I would really like to acknowledge the ancestors who lived on this land, which were the Lakota, Dakota, and later the Ojibwa nations. Miigwech.
Well, thank you so much for introducing yourselves and for taking time on this very special day, Indigenous Peoples Day, to join us in this very important conversation. And we're all going to hold out hope that, that Daisy will be able to join us shortly as well. For everyone listening, I do have a series of questions that I want to ask our special guests, but do want to reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes of our webinar today to ensure that all of you who've been generous enough with your time to join us today will have a chance to ask some questions as well. My first question is for the entire group, and we don't have to respond in a particular order, but if the spirit moves you, feel free to begin to address this first question. And I've set the context for our time together today within the context of it being Indigenous Peoples Day, and that we're going to have a very important conversation. I'd like to ask each of you, if you could, to speak to share some of your reflections on Indigenous Peoples Day, and why do you believe that our conversation today focused on substance disorders and advancing health equity in Native communities is so important to our respective cultural communities, to our states where we reside, to our nation, and for the organizations that we all work with in our profession more broadly.
I'll go ahead and share on that first, if you don't mind. I'm just, again, really thankful that we're able to come in this collaborative way and for here Indigenous Peoples Day. For a long time, Natives have struggled with the Columbus Day story, as it does not, it's not accurate. However, our history books will keep repeating the same colonized story. So for last year and the year before, when the government started recognizing that, and with President Biden, has been a victory of sorts. And identifying that our cultural vibrancy and connectedness and the strength is still here of our people.
Thank you, Sarita.
I'll share, if you don't mind, Andrew. Today is an important day to me because of recognition of the Indigenous people, that we were not destroyed, we're not gone, we're still living, breathing, active members of this land and this society. One of the things that I do and friends of mine do in this area is that we make sure to wear moccasins today, and that we dress more traditionally than we do most days, just to represent Indigenous culture, Indigenous peoples, and claim ourselves.
No, thank you so much, Cecelia. Some of what you share really resonates with me. That point that you make around today is significant because it's a reminder that Native peoples are still here, right? In some ways, partly reflective of how segregated our societies are, how little contact many Americans have with Native peoples, Native communities. There's this sense among many, unfortunately, right, that the real Indians no longer exist. And I appreciate the ways in which you amplify, right, that the meaning of this holiday is one way to remind us of the cultural strength, resilience, and survival of Native peoples across our continent.
I also wanted to add, I also wanted to add, yes, of course, I want to just say I acknowledge both of Sarita and Cecelia, and very much so just the vibrancy and waking up every day is a good day to be Indigenous. But especially today, I'm excited to see, how Phoenix, Arizona downtown is acknowledging all of our people, that we're resilient and that we're still here, and everyone will get a taste of all of the different tribes and peoples and Indigenous peoples that are here, particularly in Phoenix. It's the melting pot of intertribal nations here in Phoenix. So it's a really exciting day. So I'm really grateful that we're doing this today.
Thank you, Celina. Heidi, I heard that maybe you were trying to get in to add a comment or reflection as well.
Yes, I just wanted to say what today means to me is to honor the past, present, and the future. It reminds me of my ancestors' resilience, perseverance, strength, sacrifices, and we're seen as the first people. And then why this conversation having today is important. It helps me better help my people, Alaska Natives, Native Americans, to help them the way that we heal Indigenous practices and traditional healing. And being a person in long-term recovery, I better understand and I could better help others because I'm Indigenous and I know how I heal. It better helps me, with the Indigenous people healing also, and gives them, that little mustard seed of hope that they could do it also.
Well, thank you, Heidi, for sharing kind of what this day means to you and what this conversation means to you. And in many ways, you've really articulated, my hopes and visions for our time together today. Partly that it'll be this space of open and vulnerable sharing, and appreciate you naming your recovery story, which is so much, in the tradition of those of us who work in this field, that we start with our own story and are honest and open about our own journey toward healing and recovery. And, my hope is too that our conversation today will give us at a personal level and also at a professional level some ideas, some visions, greater reason for hope, that there are culturally grounded ways that we can really help to diminish, the really devastating impact of the substance use disorder crisis and the opioid overdose crisis impacting our communities. And for me, that's part of why this day is significant as well, that I set the context for our conversation within the larger context of the range of critical issues, right, impacting Native communities within the larger, with the larger important point that Native peoples are resilient and strong and have amazing cultural strengths that, as you're saying, are being utilized, right, to offer hope and healing. And my hope is that our conversation today will give us all, right, a little more wisdom, a little bit more knowledge, skillfulness, and spiritual energy, right, to continue our work. And as we look at these issues here, right, in the state of Minnesota, in my own community that I identify with most closely, African American, the opioid overdose rate is 5 times as high as it is for white Americans. And we look at natives in Minnesota, those rates are 7 times as high. I mean, we are really, I think, at a critical moment, a crisis moment. And to me, this is one of the more critical human rights, racial equity, ethnic equity issues of our time. And I think that's part of what I think for me adds to the urgency and significance and meaning of our conversation today. And as we've looked to kind of better understand the root causes of the patterns of substance use disorder in our community, and we'll start there before moving into really promising, hopeful approaches to addressing these issues. It looks like Daisy has joined us, so let me stop there and allow Daisy a chance to introduce herself to our webinar participants today. Hello, Daisy, welcome.
Good morning. Sorry about my tardiness. The school bus thing has been a number on us single parents, so got to get your kids where they got to go. But I'm Daisy, formerly clinical manager of recovery services. I am now a crisis assessor. So I primarily are doing same-day assessments now on definitely a lot of crisis need that we've seen uptick in the last month or two. And I know Heidi and I will get into that a little bit later with kind of what's going on with Alaska and some of the grave issues that we're having right now. But I'm glad to be here.
No, glad you could join us. It's quite amazing to think about how far apart we each are, and here we are all as parents navigating the similar challenging issues, right, of helping get our children to school when our school systems are having a hard time, partly because of defunding, right, and being able to identify an adequate supply of bus drivers to get our children to school. So happy you could join us, and your last comments there really amplified the point I was making. Is I created this space for you to introduce yourself, that, you know, this is the substance use disorder, kind of the patterns that we see, particularly in Indigenous and Black and Brown communities. It's really a crisis proportion and one of the major, I think, racial, ethnic equity issues of our time. With alarming rates here in Minnesota, where Native peoples, their overdose death rate is 7 times as high as that for Euro Americans. And as we look to begin to understand the root causes, right, of the crisis and its different kind of faces across our country, oftentimes we hear people in our field, we hear psychologists and others speak to the role of intergenerational trauma as really a deeper historical root cause of this. I'm wondering if any of you could speak to your understanding, how you make meaning of this reference and idea that partly what's informing the patterns of substance use disorder we see in our communities and other challenges is intergenerational trauma.
So I'll speak to that a little bit, Andrew. We think about intergenerational trauma, and so often when this comes up, we hear people say, that was in the past, or this happened then, and we have to live in the now. But you know, our children are only now coming home from the boarding schools where they were killed and buried, and their families didn't know. That's a very recent and present trauma. So you throw the last couple of years on top of that, wherein Indigenous people suffered the COVID-19 virus and the lacks and the inability to even get supplies, the isolation even greater. The trauma is happening and it's being repeated, and we need to be able to address it instead of just trying to minimize it.
No, thank you, Cecelia, as you share your understanding and how you make meaning of this, of the impact of intergenerational trauma. I'm reminded of the quote from James Baldwin that says that history is not our past, but it very much also lives in our present. And what you're saying is that the historical patterns of genocide, colonization, violence against Native peoples does reverberate into the present still, and has an impact on well-being and health in our communities. But I think also, right, within what you share, Cecelia, is that seed, right, that we'll come back to, that, you know, although we can speak to the past as part of the problem, right, we should not obscure, right, the current patterns of discrimination and other parts of the lived experience of Native people that contribute to the patterns of substance use disorder that we do see. Would anyone else like to speak to the issue of intergenerational trauma and its relationship to substance use disorder in Native communities?
Yeah, I'd like to add something there. Just like Cecelia said about the boarding schools, going away to these schools, you know, kids were kidnapped and taken from their families. So there's that disconnect from having that nurturing. The hair was cut. They were stripped from their customs, traditional, spiritual. Hair is spiritual. The hair is kept long, and they would cut it in the schools. And there is a quote from one of the schools, Carlisle School, who said, you know, to kill the Indian, save the man. And that was the trajectory of these schools, and in residential schools in Alaska, and then Canadian borders, and then down here is boarding schools. And so it's recovering from that. And like Cecelia said, it's not that it was so long ago. We're still dealing with the trauma of that being separated, our traditions being taken from us. And we didn't have a spiritual freedom until 1979. And most of us realize that wasn't too long ago, that we now get to have our spiritual ceremonies without hiding and So all that kind of goes together and impacts us today, because the grandmas and the grandpas, didn't get to pass down traditional stuff. Some did because they go into hiding and pass down traditional teachings. But the substance use comes in from not being disconnected, from those traditional ways. And the answer is getting back into culture and traditions. And so it's very important that we recognize that it just doesn't go away. And there is still traumas happening today, like Cecelia had just explained. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Sarita, for sharing your perspective on the meaning and significance of intergenerational trauma. And I really appreciate what you share with us, right? That this intergenerational trauma, or the historical trauma, right, of having your family murdered in front of you, seeing members of your community sexually assaulted, crops destroyed, hair cut, having your children sent off to boarding schools, your communities burned down, that still reverberates. That created a certain disconnect, created a certain woundedness, right? And as you say, it hasn't really been that long. And if we really think about it and pause, it makes complete sense, right? That there's still some healing work to do, right? To address some of the unattended, right, trauma that's impacted Native communities historically. I would note that in a very important series that came out from Teb Alcorn, who's a journalist I had a chance to interview for our Recovery Equity series, which will be rolling out here soon in October. He really amplifies the voices of Native people to remind us that it is important to bring in the focus intergenerational trauma, but as our guests have identified in our conversation already today, that can be a much too narrow focus. That makes it really seductive to still kind of put the locus of change on Native peoples to heal themselves from the intergenerational trauma. And it doesn't speak, right, to the ongoing consequences, as Sarita did so beautifully, right, of the unequal treatment of Native peoples, the ongoing patterns of colonization and discrimination that are evident, right, really vividly, right, in issues around health disparities, especially in terms of substance use disorder. And, part of what I've appreciated in my previous conversations with all of our guests today are the ways they've helped me to more fully understand the complexities and nuances of the current crisis, and how there's really no single, although we speak of the value and need for culturally appropriate approaches, that there's no single cookie cutter approach, to addressing the issues, because, the cause and dynamics behind the crisis are variable from one state and one region to another. With that as a little bit of context, I'd love to ask Daisy and Heidi to speak to some of what they shared with me in our previous conversations around the very specific contours and face of the SUD crisis in Alaska Native communities, and what are some of the contemporary forces behind this crisis and lingering health disparities associated with it.
I guess this is kind of multifaceted for me, because I represent Alaska. I've been here 13 years, but I'm also from Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. And so when we were talking about generational trauma, it's very different between the two regions, but both suffer quite the same. And as somebody who has quite often been told I'm not Native enough, still to this day, like, it's still alive. That's one of those things about racism. It's kind of for every color, every shape or size. It's never gone away. It's still very much here. So we're still evidently fighting it every day. I would say in Alaska, the tricky part is the desolation that we have within the state and the villages that we have, the sunlight, the amount, in the wintertime, we're starting to get into it. And so we're starting to see an uptick of substance use and a lot of suicidal ideation right now. Regional, just thinking about, so even just this summer, Alaska had the most rain in Alaska history. The tricky part, what that means for us, is that we have not gotten enough vitamin D. We require that amount of vitamin D from the summertime to help us make it through the winter time and the super dark months. We didn't have that this year. So what we're seeing is an incredible uptick just coming in from the villages. We have a lot going on in our villages that don't necessarily have access to care. I know that we have excellent technology in Alaska. I will give them major props for that we're able to provide telehealth to a lot of these regions. And I know Heidi can speak a lot more toward our north region because it seems to struggle the most because it has the least daylight and the most daylight and things like that. But the biggest part is just understanding a lot of our places in this state, you either have to get to them either boat or snow machine, right? So anybody has health concerns, stuff like that, they got to fly into Anchorage. They got to do all of these pieces. So along those same lines, you have to want Western medicine to even get on that plane to come to Anchorage, right? So there's that component, is that we get them into Anchorage and then we want to make them Anchorage, right? When they don't live here. This isn't their culture. This isn't what their village is like. So I know Heidi and I are part of the huge initiative to really work on the cultural peer support side of things to make sure that they still feel at home here and that we're not trying to take that away, because that still definitely happens. But I would say lack of availability, you also see that in Oklahoma too, but a huge disparity here is, I would say, lack of transportation and lack of funding. The cost of living here has become so astronomical that those that originated here almost can't afford to live here. So that is why we also have the Alaska Native population as such a large percentage of our homeless population. So it all kind of runs together. But I'll let Heidi speak a little bit more about the Northborough.
So the substance use disorder, or misuse, sorry, is in Alaska. There's so many different things, that contribute the substance use, the overdoses, the intergenerational traumas, with there's just so many different components that come in. And when you're so new to using drugs and alcohol, I mean, it was never in our DNA to know how to, function under the influence. We see a lot of suicidal ideation. I know we have the highest rate per capita in the United States, but one thing that I do in my position is I coordinate, these cultural activities for the people that do come in from the villages that are OCS involved, or, they're going through court for something, or they need to go to treatment because they don't have it in the village. My biggest piece that I contribute to CITC is I bring in the cultural activities, the cultural traditions, the curriculum that we read, the Red Road to Wellbriety, and the smudging, and just really going back to organic roots here in the urban village of Anchorage, because we do live in the biggest village in the state of Alaska. There's about 270,000 that live in this whole city of Anchorage. But yeah, we've been super successful with those numbers, and we just have people that they literally said they look forward to this group every single week, because they know it reminds them of home and it connects them to their culture, whether if we're smudging, sharing our recovery stories, we're having potlucks, or we're doing a cultural activity that I teach. There's just so many different components, like I said, that go into substance use in Alaska, and for me and my stories, just really being a cycle breaker, breaking cycles of intergenerational traumas, from addictive behaviors to the simplest things, I've been in recovery now for a little over 7 years, and I'm still learning, I'm still a baby in recovery compared to these old timers that I see all the time. But yeah, I could speak on so many different things in Alaska.
No, thank you, Heidi, for that response, and planning really, laying the bridge work for where our conversation is going, which is to talk about, I think the really powerful ways each of you, right, in different ways, has really seized the power of Indigenous culture, to offer hope and healing. One other point I want to come back to, and Daisy, maybe you can speak to this. One point I remember from our conversation, that part of what's fueled the really rapid increase or the rise in substance use disorder has to do with the geography of Alaska, as you say, not just the distance between one's village and treatment facilities, but also that, you have this, it's largely also the many port cities, if I'm not mistaken, like Anchorage, right? And it's provided sort of easier access for cartels. I'm wondering if you might speak to that before we move over to Celina to hear some about some of the issues in Arizona.
Of course. This has been, so I've been really involved with Millennium Health and things like that as the clinical manager, getting our statistics. I know that as of, I think it was September, we were up 800% for fentanyl use in the state of Alaska. And the only way that it truly can get into us is through our ports. We have had some major busts in Ketchikan. We have them in Anchorage. They're trying to go more for our desolate villages, but we have directly linked them to the cartel, that they have found Alaska to be just a ready source to be able to bring it into. And then we can actually transport it down into Canada and to Seattle and those things. It's been a huge uptick. We know that, so a lot of places have ground, I would say more like ground support, right, for a lot of states. And I know she's about to talk about Arizona, so she understands a little bit what I'm saying, right? There's more boots on the ground to be able to intervene in these things. We don't necessarily have that, right? So, and then you have a good example. This is actually really relatively recent. A good example of a lot of states suffer with resources, but us being 2.5 size, 2.5 the size of Texas, right? So, but we have very few supports when it comes to these things. So you didn't hear a lot about us when we almost just lost a few of our villages because of the tsunami that we just had 2 weeks ago, right? It made CNN, I think, for like a day, right? And wow, that is very symbolic of what happens in Alaska, right? It's really just, oh, it's just Alaska. Oh, it's just Alaska. When we have this huge volume of land, right? And so many different little crevices that it can get in, and it's working it in through all of them. Yeah, the amount of fentanyl and the amount of methamphetamine that's increased in per COVID, because that's what we were actually really alarmed about, is our numbers went up during COVID. And you would think that it would be harder to access, right? Because everybody's on quarantine and all of these pieces. But the only thing that was still relatively stayed pretty on top of it was our ports. And we've had millions and millions of dollars in busts at this point, especially through our Ketchikan port. So yes, it's they found us. They found that we are a lucrative state, I guess, because there's a lot of suicidal ideation, a lot of depression. People are reaching out for things. They want something to try to make them feel better. And so they're providing it, and we're losing people. They're dropping like flies from fentanyl right now.
Well, thank you, Daisy, for your response and helping us sort of connect the significance of geography, and how geography itself plays a role in fueling this ongoing opioid crisis, which you name, and the way that you name it in terms of fentanyl being a real driver really kind of echoes what I saw just this morning in our own Minneapolis newspaper around fentanyl really being the driving force behind the radical increase in opioid overdose deaths here in the Twin Cities area. Celina, I'm wondering if you could speak to some of these issues in your context there in Arizona, but knowing that you work on a national level as well.
Yes, absolutely. My heart goes out to Daisy and to Heidi for the work that you do there in Alaska. I was thinking it really does sound a lot like Hawaii also. I have a lot of family members who are, seeking treatment. And it's really hard because of their houselessness, because of the resources there. But here living in Arizona, I have the opportunity to go through and work with several different recovery centers, and also as a presenter, and then working on the Strongmen Project. There was 180 Native men who came out and participated, and even more so who were interested that we couldn't get into the project, who were suffering with just that fentanyl use, overcoming, seeking treatment, them going to treatment. We even had someone who went to treatment, came out, was doing a great job at just coming back on top and started working out and all the things, and went back to using, and he lost his life. And so we're seeing a lot of that as well, especially with the heat situation and the lack of resources and people dying of dehydration on our streets, people choosing to live on the streets because they have easier access for the fentanyl. We're seeing fentanyl coming through the borders, and you're constantly hearing, close the border, close the border. But more so than that, I think that the boots on the ground, as Daisy had mentioned, there's so many other ways, and it's not just through the borders. You know, it's coming all the way around through Alaska, through Seattle, and just right into Arizona. So, I mean, there's a will, there's a way, unfortunately. And so the opportunity that I have to speak my truth and share my heart, but more in a holistic fashion, and being a facilitator of talking circles, whether they be in person or virtually, and just sharing your heart and being open to sharing stories. Because, you know, as we all know, we mentioned the generational trauma. I am a child of the trauma, you know, and looking back at all of our relatives and where that came from, learning about that. My mom, as a genealogist and a historian, we're seeing that our grandparents and great-grandparents and the suffering that they have had. And so there's just so many different things and so many different levels, and I'm able to work with so many different people of different tribes, ethnic backgrounds, who just need a little bit more love and the cultural identity, and tapping into those ceremonies and traditions, and having the traditional side and a medicine person to work with, and someone who looks like them and talks like them, and offering. But I would say that fentanyl, the fentanyl use here and overdose is just, it's crazy. That's the easiest, you know, it is. We go to McDonald's to take our kids real quick to get an ice cream cone just down the street from my house. And I live in a pretty nice neighborhood, and there's people smoking it on the corner. So it's out there, and unfortunately now our children are seeing it. And so having to have these deep conversations sooner than later with our kids, those are the types of things that we're also doing in some of the recovery houses, is inviting children to come and have that open dialogue, to ask questions, but also to hear some stories and to work with some of the participants that are there. So,
Cecelia, thank you. Thank you for your response, and helping us deepen our understanding of the complexities and the diverse faces of the crisis in different regions. And you've also helped us to kind of, you know, build that bridge into moving from just talking about the scope and magnitude of the current crisis and issues to solutions, and the ways in which you've leveraged culture, and the ways in which you, each in different ways, and the programs you're a part of have leveraged culture to offer healing. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the Strong Man Project, and tell us a little bit more around the ways in which you utilize and leverage culture in the work that you do.
yes, absolutely. It was a big joke 2 years ago when they asked if we could do a project with specifically Native men, and if we could do it virtually, because we were at the height of the pandemic. And we said, Skoden, let's do this, you know. And so we utilized an amazing friend of mine who's, you know, we've been traveling Indian country now for the last 8 years together, and the founder of Healthy Active Natives. And I reached out to him and I said, this is what they want us to do. So there was a grant from the National Institute of Health, and through the Strong Heart study, and Washington State University. And we created and leveraged this amazing opportunity for Native men across the nation. We had participants in Alaska, Hawaii. There are Native people in Hawaii. And here in Arizona, 180 Native men came out and actively participated in lowering their A1C, if they were borderline diabetic, and actively participated in workouts and talking circle style groups weekly. And so it has been just awesome to see that our men need the healing, but they all need these really safe spaces that are led by men. So it was the joke also around our house. What did I do all day on Zoom? I was chasing Native men. So some of these men have became my brothers. They're still working out on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you know, bringing back the culture, bringing back that safe space for Native men to share their hearts and talk about things that are hard to hear. You know, men in general, as we know, don't want to go to the doctor and they wait till the last minute. And so these Native men were taking their health back into their hands. And I was facilitating morning fast with the men, and they are learning how to check their own glucose over camera. If you can imagine that, weighing themselves, checking their measurements, their hips and their stomachs, and then creating plans of action. So if you can think about the larger scale of how this is working, we have so many layers of identity crises. We have the trauma, we have all these things. However, we also have all of these amazing, beautiful things. We are medicine, we are powerful, we are resilient. And so amongst 180 Native men, I was the only woman. But what we know, you know, as Native people, is that you need that good balance, right? You need the masculine energy and you need that feminine energy, and it comes together and it comes full circle and beautiful healing happens. And I feel so grateful and I get so passionate talking about it because we need more spaces and places like that for our Native people, and specifically our men, because there aren't any out there. For our Native women, we cook, we eat, we have these beautiful gatherings, and we have a lot of inner, you know, men and women sweats, and we have these feasts and we have ceremony where there's men and women, but there's not very many open spaces for our men. And so we brought forth virtually in the last 2 years this really exciting project where there's a documentary coming out soon, and you get to see some of this healing. We have a lot of men that are in recovery with, you know, alcohol use disorders, and they're going to treatment and seeking treatment, or going into the Red Road meetings because of the other brothers that were in their circles, encouraging them and loving them from across the computer and encouraging them to go to treatment. So I could say so much on that, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but thank you so much for letting me share that.
No, thank you, Celina, so much for giving us a window into the really transformative healing work that you're doing and the central role that culture and community play.